And welcome back to another episode of Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 166, season 4, episode 6. Our topic of the week is on making moral decisions. We've been on this subject for the last number of weeks, and I think for me, it's been super interesting as a deep dive to really get inside our morality and our ethics and our values and appreciating where the forefathers are on these subjects because they're so informative and so impactful in the way in which we go about thinking about these subjects. Excuse me. And in another week, that was not an easy week here. Every week is difficult. They're difficult for different reasons. But I think now, as you sort of move into a space where it feels like it's still going, it's on and on and on, it's past 40 days, and doesn't feel like there's an end in sight, even though there's been progress made by Israel's Defense Force, and there have been actions taken, and it does feel like there's been a degradation in the forces of the enemy. It still feels like it's moving and on some level maybe even dragging, which is a horrible thing to say, because they have to do their work, and it doesn't happen in an instant, even though we live in this instant gratification type of society. The work is difficult work. I imagine I've never been in war. I've never fought, other than what I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, not to belittle it, just with siblings or with friends. I've never fought in an army. I've never been in a war. I've never been in a battle. And so we want more answers, and we want them more quickly, and we don't get them. And now what you feel like, or what I feel like, is that the pressures from outside have increased, and the noise and the question marking and the sort of hindsight 2020 types get into the situation and now questioning every decision that's being made. And I feel like for some people it gets harder and harder to answer and harder to stay with. Question you hear a lot is, as the numbers increase, the numbers of dead increase on the Palestinian side, let's say, where's the number? Where's the line? I'm sure the same question can be asked on the Israel side as well. It's the number of maybe soldiers who are killed in battle increases. Is there a point at which it becomes untenable to continue and feel forced and have to stop? These are very deep and hard and dense questions. And the decision making that goes into them, the moral, the ethical, the value systems that are challenged and questioned to get to those decisions, it's heavy stuff. When it's sort of just choosing between, to put a very soft spin on it, you're in the supermarket and you're choosing between apples and oranges. Like, okay, they're not the same fruit, but they're both fruit, and the decision might not change very much. It might affect a dessert that you're making or something, whatever it is. And maybe you'll upset a child in your home or someone in your home because you chose apples over oranges and you can only choose one. Like, okay, like that's not the biggest deal in the world. But when the decisions become really heady and really deep and really hard, and it's life decisions that are being made, and people's lives are on the line, like it moves into a different space. And so, whereas we've talked about having more clarity in defining an issue, perhaps, and we've talked about last week about making the case when you were in a decision-making space, and Eliezer prosecutes and executes that situation almost flawlessly, those are great. But what about sort of taking a few minutes and stepping back and thinking through how I make those decisions? And what about if I had the chance to do it again, would I do them again? How do we go through all these kinds of different things? And how do we then build up a character of moral decision making and ethical decision making that is stronger, maybe you're more universal, that's more inclusive and is deeper spiritually. I would say, and then humanly, that's a word, the humanity of the decision making, to move sort of how a person thinks from sort of one level to the next level. And so we get there this week because there are actually two stories to sort of work through, but we're only going to work through one in this week's Torah reading, which is our guide every week. It's amazing how this sort of helps us sort of think through and work through a lot of these issues, is just simply by ruminating and talking about and thinking through and learning and studying the decision making approach and policies and maybe mistakes that people who came before us make. There's a great quote from Tony Robbins, who I haven't quoted here in a long, long time, but his quote is very simple. It's in your moments of decision that your destiny is shaped. I think that's true. I think you see that very clearly in this week's portion from the stories of Jacob, particularly, because I think to some degree when we meeting our forefathers in the Bible, Abraham and Isaac and matriarchs as well, Sarah and Rebecca, Leah and Rachel. Like everything that's going on there is their humanity is on display, and the decision making is on display, and how they handle situations is on display. We talked a couple of years ago about Rebecca specifically and how she almost feels like she's playing chess a little bit with her sons and her husband, and manipulating. It feels like manipulating, maneuvering the pieces to get to Jacob being in the spot where he's able to get the blessings. We talked in that space about the idea of commitment, how far someone goes with commitment. But there's like this whole back and forth in there, but how that decision got made and how that plays out, everybody's role. Rabbi Sachs has a set of articles across his writings on this week's portion, because I do think this week's portion gets into a different level of decision making and moral play, with the story of Jacob, quote unquote, stealing the blessings from his brother Esau in English for a lot of people, and how that goes down. It's an amazing story. Rabbi Sachs talks in one of the articles about the idea that everyone acts what he would call in righteousness to some degree. The idea that everybody is doing the right thing based on their perspective in those moments. And I think it's super interesting to think that through. And he does a masterful job of weaving and understanding, sort of looking at it from different perspectives and appreciating what's going on from everyone's perspective, and the idea that it's possible maybe that everybody acted right, even though maybe what the result wasn't exactly right. What's also interesting about the decision making that's going on in this week's portion is the idea that on some level later on we get to revisit it, which is really interesting. Rabbi Sachs writes about this also, the idea that as time goes on into the future, Jacob to some degree seems to resent what he did here, and has this interest in rectifying the decision making that he made here in this week's portion later on. And he almost seems to be trying to give back the blessing that he stole from his brother. It's fascinating reading, and I think there's a lot in that. Just through the course of his life's decisions and the results and the impact, and when he feels like it's sort of almost retributional to some degree in the relationship of his sons, all of his sons together, the relationship of his wives together, his relationship in the rebuilding and repairing of his relationship with his brother later on. There's a sense, and I think it's a really powerful and interesting reading of the story, that Jacob is trying to rectify and redo the moment by almost giving back the blessing later on. But it's getting ahead of ourselves, because I do think what's important to appreciate here, and the one I want to spend a little bit more time on here today, is actually not that second story, because I think that second story is what it is. And as I said, you could teach it all kinds of different theories that can go into there. It's actually the one before that. The one before that, and I'm going to leave Isaac out of these decisions. His story, we talked about him our first year in terms of grittiness, which I think is still super accurate, and there's a ton more to talk about him. But I want to focus in on Jacob in an earlier decision. Jacob is sitting there. It's in chapter, I think it's in chapter 26. It's not 26, I apologize, that's not correct. It's in chapter 25, sorry. Near the end of chapter 25. Esav is coming back from the field. He is tired. He is hungry. His brother Jacob is sitting there. For some reason, he's making food. He's making lunch or dinner. He's cooking up some sort of a soup. And Esav makes a request of his brother to feed him some of the soup. It seems such a strange little story. And Jacob jumps on it and he says, I'll give you soup if you sell me your birthright. I mentioned last year briefly that it seemed like an odd thing. And as I sort of went a little deeper on it, it still seems like an odd thing to me. And so what I want to do here with you for a few minutes is to get inside the headspace of Jacob, to appreciate maybe the circumstances that surround this decision, because I think it's very informative of how he thinks about these things and how he's going to execute on the decision-making process in his life. In the greater exploration, we could look at some of the later decisions that he makes in retrospect and in hindsight and in light of this decision. And so in this moment, he's sitting there. Let's paint the scene. Okay? Jacob is sitting there around a fire. He has a pot of soup, lentil soup, that is cooking on the fire, and he's stirring that pot of soup, and he's watching it, waiting for it to cook. He's baked bread, so there's bread baking nearby, and so there's this wafting smell of soup and bread. He's going to eat. He's going to eat something. His brother comes back from the field, and he's exhausted. Text is not clear as to what he's doing in the field. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But on the basic level, he's tired, he's hungry, and he asks his brother, hey man, can you give me some food? I'm starving over here. Who hasn't said something like that? Oh, I'm starving. And so instead of Jacob sort of immediately saying, yeah, I'll give you some soup, he launches into a trade negotiation. I'll give you soup on the condition that what? So if you're a young person, maybe there's something you want from a sibling or from a friend, and you're going to go and say, look, I'll give you that if you give me this, right? So if you're a little kid, you have, I don't know, a toy, and I want that toy, and if you give me your toy, I'll give you this thing, right? You have a ball, I want to play with the ball, and so let's negotiate. I get to play with your ball for an hour, and I'll give you my whatever it is for that hour. So of all things, Jacob chooses birthright. It's like, what is that? Like, where does it? It's left field if you're reading it for the first time. Having read this story, in our lives hundreds of times, perhaps, maybe it doesn't surprise us as much because we know about everything. But I think this story does get buried a little bit because the later story is so all-encompassing and involves so many different players. Here it's just the brothers. There's nobody else around. And this goes right to how Jacob thinks and how he makes these decisions. And it's informative of the decision that he's going to make later on when he is figuring out what to do with going to take the blessings and dressing up like his brother. Yes, it's many years later. It's certainly many years later. But he goes right to birthright here. As if birthright is important, or being firstborn is important. As if whatever comes with that is worth what he's about to do. Is that if he doesn't get it, maybe he's not giving his brother food. And it's like sort of astonishing. Like, there's no indication anywhere in the Bible to this point that birthright is anything, that being firstborn is meaningful in any way. His father's not firstborn. Earlier on in the Bible, when you have Cain and Abel, Cain's the elder, Abel's the younger. It does not appear that Cain gets any benefit by being the older. Now, we know from history that there's an idea that the eldest child in a family, the eldest son in a family, maybe inherits more. And we know later on, there's this idea in Torah as well, that maybe there's some sort of a double portion, or there's an additional amount, or anything of that nature, that something accrues to the firstborn. We'll know later on also the idea that the firstborn sons were supposed to be the priests later on, and then that gets taken away from them. Again, that's sort of us imposing hindsight into the situation. In this moment, Jacob seeks birthright for food. That's the trade. So it's important to him, it's valuable to him, it's meaningful to him, and he's willing to not feed his brother for birthright. But let's take it a little bit further. Let's allow for midrashic text to come into to give it a little bit more color to the story. Based on how we understand the texts and how the midrashic literature understands the texts, at this moment in time, Jacob and his brother Esav are 15 years old. The grandfather, Abraham, has just passed away. So Isaac is in mourning. The family is obviously in mourning. A great man has passed. It's their grandfather. And in the mind of Jacob, his mind is wandering to much deeper questions. He's 15. He grew up in this house. His father is this fascinating person known as Isaac, who is righteous and holy, and went through this event known as the binding of Isaac. Their mother is this incredible woman named Rebecca, who comes from this foreign land, who takes over this house, replaces the matriarch Sarah, and she's building this home. And for 20 years, they didn't have children, and they had these two boys, and now it's 15 years later, and the grandfather, whose house sort of, I would imagine, overwhelms everything about who they are and how they live, is now gone. Imagine you get to asking yourself a lot of questions. You're thinking about your role in the world, bigger picture, heavy, harsh reality of life is setting in because someone has passed away. He's not around when the grandmother passes away. He doesn't know his family from the other side, from Rebecca's side, because they're in a faraway land. So this is the man of the house. Like, Abraham is gone. And it's in that moment that he's sitting under that tree at that bench making this food. All right, the commentaries talk about the idea that the food that he's making is the food of a mourner. And then traipses in his brother, Esav, from the field, does not seem to care a lick that the grandfather passed away, is not in any sort of mourning or despair or upsetness, doesn't affect him in the least. And you're experiencing this, and you're sitting there and you're stirring this pot. You're not joyous when you're stirring and you're sitting making this food. This is like a sad and heavy moment for you. And this brother who's, he seems like so overwhelming and so much and like too much. And I'm dying over here. Give me some food. And you're like, what the heck? Seriously, man? And I imagine then things that are stirring in you about your relationship with your brother are coming to the fore. And the manner in which he's treated maybe in the house in moments better than you, or maybe that Esav represents a certain kind of personality, physicality, mentality, emotional state. And maybe you're a little bit sort of envious and jealous, and maybe there's something to the idea that the text tells us that the father loved the elder son and the mother loved the younger son, and he's He's clamoring for some respect or some dignity or some love from his father and from his brother. And now the grandfather who had a relationship with him is gone. And whew, it's a lot. So it's weighing on you. And you're looking at this moment and it bothers you that something will accrue to your brother simply because he's born first. Something that, based on maybe your understanding of what that thing is, he has no right to, does not deserve, should not have, none of it. So you devise a plan. You're 15 years old, you devise a plan because you know you have him over a barrel at this moment and he doesn't care that much, and so you're gonna take it. And so you do. You devise this plan where when he comes in this moment and he asks for food, you're going to give him food on the condition that he sells you this birthright that you know is meaningless to him. And you're going to make him swear on it that it's meaningless to him, basically. And then that he is he's cut himself off from it. And this is the decision you're going to make. And in your mind, from a moral, ethical, value standpoint, this makes total sense. But when you step out of it, now that you were in it, right? So you're inside Jacob's mind, you're inside the moment, you're inside that space. You probably have had this decision as well in your life where something has come up, something that's big, and you're working it through and you're in your mind, and there's no question that you're 1,000% right in executing in this manner. And at 15, you rule the world and you know everything. And you can do no wrong. And as you step out of it, or you gain knowledge by education of years and life experience, maybe not. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe there's a mistake there. Maybe you regret it. Maybe you don't. And so when you look at you study moral philosophy a little bit, which I've done over the last number of weeks in sort of trying to talk about these subjects, and you look into how people make moral decisions, and you study some of the articles and some of the papers and some of the experiments that were done to appreciate how people make moral decisions and where in the course of one's life their moral decision-making processes shift, and in the context of the world right now where every moment feels like when you're reading the press or you're watching something online, it's a gotcha moment and someone's trying to expose your lack of morality in your decision making or how you think or how you sit in this war moment. A lot of questions that come to your mind. And they should. It's not here to judge a 15-year-old boy in this story so much as I think it is eye-opening towards the rest of his story. This is how he thinks at 15. This is how he thinks when he's operating on his own. This is how he decides to go about getting to where he thinks he needs to be. So just to give you an example from the larger world, one of the ways that people think about moral decision-making and how decision-making shifts is they apply something that's called the universalization of a dilemma or a situation. So, for example, let's say, the example I read about in one of the articles was, let's say you live in a small town and the industry of the small town is fishing. And you develop a new hook for your fishing rod, and it's way more successful. And so you use it. It's your competitive advantage. No one would look at you and think, oh, it's terrible, it's wrong that he does that because he has a competitive advantage. If you're living in a competitive environment or you're living in an economy where people are looking for advantages to sell more fish, whatever it may be. But if you look at it slightly differently and say, you know what, everyone's going to use that new hook, then it might be that the moral decision to use the hook in the first place is wrong, because what happens now is that there's no fish left, because you've all learned how to use this new hook and you've all applied it, and now it's affected the economy because now there's no fish left in the area where you live because everybody has gotten so good at it. So when you universalize, sometimes it changes the way we look at it. So take the stories from the Bible. If every sibling goes into these situations trying to manipulate their older sibling out of something, that's probably not good. It probably does not produce a long term good or benefit for all of society. When it's reduced down to one person, maybe it's different. Or we sort of look at dilemma slightly differently by, the options that are available to us, and then those affect how we value judge a certain situation. The very famous trolley dilemma. I don't think I discussed it here. The trolley dilemma is the idea that there is a trolley coming, there's a train coming down the track, and on one avenue on the track or one direction on the track, there's four people that are working there, and they have no idea that that train is coming. And you have the ability to stop the train. So obviously, if that's the case, where it's coming down and there's one direction and there's four people there, and you can stop the train, you can save their lives, you're going to do that. So you're going to divert the train to another direction. Obvious. As they develop the trolley dilemma, the ability to save those four people requires you to kill another person, either directly or indirectly. So let's take the indirect circumstance, which is this. By diverting the train to another track, that's what you did. You operated on the track and you moved the train from one track to the other track. On that other track, there's one person. So saving four people requires you on some level, involuntarily or indirectly, to kill another person. How does that change your decision? Do you now do it? Now you're looking at it. Now I'm not just saving four people, I'm saving four people, but it's at the cost of killing one person. I'm not directly killing the person, it's indirect because I'm just manipulating the trains. Take it a third, where let's say the person, that one person, the singular person, is a terrible, horrible person. How does that change the decision-making process? Because the person who's the one that you're now debating is a terrible, horrible person. Or the opposite. The four, who are the majority, are really terrible people, and the one is a super righteous person, and so you're shifting the train to kill a righteous person, and you're leaving four terrible, horrible people alive. Or change it the third way, which is what they do. Is one way to stop it. Another way to stop it is to throw someone onto the tracks to stop the train. So you decide that, no, I'm not going to kill those four people or that one person. I'm going to manipulate a circumstance where the initial person gets onto the tracks, gets hit by the train, and stops everything, right? There's no end to the moral dilemmas at play in the trolley dilemma, but it allows you to develop the way you think. Are you universalizing these kind of situations? Is that how you're going to go about it, and you're going to prosecute that kind of circumstance? Are you going to look at it from a slightly different perspective? Right? How do you go about this? This is how we do this. And we could think, you know what, in one case it's good, in another case, it's bad. And we could make a moral judgment, and we could evaluate it immediately in the immediate moment and say, okay, good, bad. And we do. The science and the data seem to indicate that most of our moral decision making, when we make those decisions, we make them in a flash, we make them very quickly, we don't sit on them. Maybe that's the case with Jacob. He just immediately decides that this is the action he's going to take, and he takes, and he doesn't dwell on it too long. But I can tell you, it would seem to indicate, and that's what I was mentioning earlier with the Rebbe Sachs texts and others as well, that he seems to later on have some sort of a hindsight moment where he is unsure about the decision he has made. We have to appreciate that that in our decision making and in our moral clarity, in our ability to develop and to move sort of stages in our moral development as human beings, we're going to come to these crossroads. They're not going to be so black and white, make these decisions. They're not going to be gotcha moments. They're going to be, in some cases, just very subtle on the edge for some people, but for you, it's like everything, something that might cause you to compromise a basic principle of your being. In the current environment, when it's a war zone situation and there are people dying, both sides, and it's a question of assessing or, applying blame somewhere, is that enough? Like, is that how you want to think about it? Maybe that's when you start to get queasy and uncomfortable about some of the decisions. When they ask questions about the numbers, at what point is it too many, as I mentioned earlier, too many soldiers on one side, or too many of the hostages, God forbid, or on the other side, too many Palestinian children or civilians who are killed. If you're a cold-hearted snake about it and you don't care about the numbers in any way, it doesn't mean anything to you, like that people are dying. So that's not who we're talking about here. You're also talking about in the space of people who would like to be and tend to be on the moral spectrum and like to have, like to think about themselves from a moral perspective on a regular basis. And so that's when it gets uncomfortable, when you have to answer those questions, the ethics and the morals of war, and the ethics and morals of going on offense in a war, the ethics and morals of trying to eliminate an enemy or a threat. Those are heavy things. And so we have to appreciate that that's always on the table, and it's always something that we have to deal with. Thankfully for me, so I'm not fighting the war on the battlefield. My children aren't on the battlefield. They don't have to make those decisions. And for me, I wouldn't say it's just an exercise in this, but it's an exercise in how we grow and how we continue to progress. As I mentioned to you, among the people in the story who have, let's say, regrets, it seems only Jacob. It's only his story that we learn. And we only learn about what the fallout is from the decision making that he effectuates in these stories. We have to appreciate, but that's what's going on. And then we have to appreciate that ultimately that decisions that we make take us to places that in theory we hope to have wanted to go. And then that's what was driving us, and that was what we're looking to when we're making big decisions, heady decisions, and important decisions, and decisions about our life, and decisions about our work. And every one of these decisions has, what I would call major impact on everything that we are. And so that's where this is. For Jacob at 15, it's a lot. But for Jacob much later on, when the story of the blessings takes place, he's not a kid. You could see that he is struggling with it. Maybe he's grown, he's learned more about his parents, about his brother, about his destiny, about what he needs and what he doesn't need, which blessings he does need, which blessings he doesn't need, what kind of things he wants to do, what things he's not wanting to do, what things he's comfortable with, what things he will sit with him well, won't sit with him well. It all goes with as you grow. And so that's where this takes me this week. And I hope that is, again, I appreciate that for the last 6 weeks, this Coaching with the Bible has been very, very different. And I appreciate you coming with me on a very long ride today. Let's end with a quote. The author of the quote is unknown, but I think it actually fits nicely here. Decisions are the hardest things to make, especially when it's a choice between where you should be and where you want to be. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you next week. Hope you're having a great week. Hope you're having a great week, and hope next week brings you more blessing and more positivity and more success than the week that was.